I forgot how this routine went. I mean, after all, we started a new book already. I can't believe it. 10 days in a book. That's what happens, though, when you end up wanting to read a 300-page book or 280-page book, which is about what this next one is, and you read for about an hour. So that was it was less than 10 hours, but that still is substantial, isn't it, when you think about reading a book? So we're going to spend some substantial time reading the new leather moccasin Bigfoot book. 60 People Who Shaped the Church. Learning from sinners. I have to put this down. Learning from sinners, saints, rogues, and heroes. Yeah, let's get to it. I've got the back of the book there in the description. I don't have the introduction in the description. I don't think I'm reading it. No. Thanks, Alan, for the book. Alton. Not Alan. Alton. Jeez, get his name right at least. If you're not even going to read his introduction. We get it. Thanks for matching your book to my decor. Chapter 1, Peter. Blue-collar businessman. Circa 1 BC to 64 AD. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Simon Peter, Matthew 16, verse 18. That's where he declared, Who do you say I am? You are the Christ, the Son of God. Powerful words, Peter, without a doubt. Who could doubt him when he said that? I mean, what I mean is in general afterwards, right? He can doubt. Who can doubt him after he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God? And as Jesus said, you can't know that. You couldn't know that. No matter. Okay. Visit a dozen churches, each preaching a sermon about the disciple Peter, and you're likely to leave with a dozen different views of the man. Was Peter the big, verbally clumsy man so often depicted? Was he a boastful man needing attention who ultimately folded under pressure from an unrelenting servant girl? Or is he the foundation stone for the church and for the first pope? Peter has a bit of an image problem. No one doubts his importance to the early church, and no one questions his role as a disciple. Many, however, focus on just one or two aspects of the man and so miss the giant of faith who forever changed the church. Peter was part of Jesus' ministry from the beginning. He was brash and exuberant, so much so that he often made statements he would have to backpedal from moments later. He was a blue-collar businessman, a man who worked long and hard. They use that word, I think, also because people will get that at this time that this was written. The copyright on this is $1960 was the first publication. So I don't know how much has changed since then, right? A working man. Jesus came as a commoner, and he chose commoners to lead his church. Every Christmas season, we celebrate the incarnation of Jesus, the coming of God in the flesh. That's what incarnation means. God in the flesh. We set up manger scenes to show the humble, harsh environment that served as the backdrop of Jesus' entrance. Preachers remind us that Jesus wasn't born in a palace or a mansion. His parents were people of humble means, living their lives under Roman oppression and the religious scrutiny that marked the day. Jesus never departed from these humble roots. He even informed an eager follower that he had no place to rest his head. Luke chapter 9, verses 57 and 58. Meaning he claimed no home of his own. Jesus depended on the support of others. It seems natural that he would pull his disciples from the ranks of those with calloused hands or who were social outcasts, such as Matthew, the tax collector. Peter was one of the former. He was a fisherman, part of a family business. His days were spent mending and casting nets, along with directing his brothers and probably other workers. The best we can tell, the business was a good one based in Capernaum, a town situated on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Commercial fishing was difficult work, but it was practical, oftentimes profitable, and the kind of occupation a man could invest his life in, support his family with, and leave to his sons when the time came. Then Jesus came on the scene with an offer to make Peter and his brother Andrew fishers of men. Peter's calling came in stages, the first while he and others were plying their trade. Mark chapter 1, verse 16 through 20. Jesus must have been known to the people of Capernaum, for Peter, Andrew, James, and John all seemed to respond to Jesus without hesitation. They simply stopped their work and followed Jesus, leaving behind their nets. This is significant. Few laborers would leave the tools of their trade behind. Perhaps Peter had employees or other family with whom he left the business. Either way, Peter appeared decisive in his acceptance of Jesus' offer. Why choose Peter? Why the other fishermen? What did Jesus see in them that he didn't see in others? The answers to these questions aren't fully revealed until 3 years later. Peter's light would not shine until the darkness was impossibly thick. Peter has given us an important but often overlooked gift. He was flawed. He spoke out of turn. He challenged Jesus, and he was often slow to understand his master's teaching. In other words, we can relate to him. Movies and books often offer plastic heroes, those who are free of faults and mistakes. The Bible shows its heroes in a realistic fashion. Peter is one of the most important people in New Testament times, yet is shown with warts and all. We see his courage and cowardice. We see him in moments of great insight despite his sluggish grasp of Jesus' message. We see him hiding, fearful of facing the same people who crucified Jesus, and yet later hear his bold proclamation of faith. Peter, Cephas, Simon, Simeon. It was not unusual for someone like Peter to be known by several names. His home of Galilee, the northern part of the Holy Land, was a cosmopolitan area, and most Jews went by 3 names based on language: Aramaic, spoken by first century Jews; Latin, the language of the Roman occupiers; and Greek, still widely used in Peter's day. The New Testament was written in Greek. It was common for people in Peter's day to have a working knowledge of all of these languages. The man we call Peter was named Simeon Bar-Jonah, Matthew 16, verse 17. Simeon is his Hebrew name that becomes Simon in Greek, hence Simon Bar-Jonah. That's interesting, isn't it? Because it's Simon Bar-Sinister, who I've mentioned. It's a cartoon character. Short guy. In the Matthew account, his Aramaic name was Cephas, which means rock. Hence Petros in Greek, which becomes Peter in English. 4 versions of his name, but one person. It is none other than Jesus, who first calls Peter Cephas, rock. You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas. John chapter 1, verse 42. Chairman of the board, Peter as leader. Jesus had many followers. At the beginning of the church, about 120 of them met for prayer. Acts chapter 1, verse 15. There was a closer circle of disciples referred to as the 70, who went out in pairs with the message of Jesus. The most familiar circle, however, was the 12, the hand-selected disciples who accompanied Jesus throughout his ministry. This is the group we normally think of when we hear the term the disciples. There was also one smaller ring of men around Jesus. Of the 12 disciples, there was an inner circle comprised of 3, Peter, James, and John. These 3 saw and experienced things the others did not. They saw the resurrection of the synagogue official's daughter. Mark chapter 5, 35 through 43. The transfiguration. Luke chapter 9, verse 28 through 45. And were with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew chapter 26, 36 through 46. I think that that's so incredible. So Peter, James, and John saw these great experiences. The resurrection of a dead daughter, of a synagogue's official of the synagogue. The transfiguration, which is seeing Jesus with Moses and Elijah, and Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. In ancient texts, like those of the New Testament, prominent individuals were listed first. In every nation of this inner circle, Peter's name comes first, every time. This is also true for each list of disciples. Matthew chapter 10, verse 2. When representatives from the temple came to collect the temple tax, all Jews paid a tax to meet the needs of the temple in Jerusalem. They came to Peter. At the greatest event in history, the resurrection, angels told the woman who had come to the tomb to take the news to Peter and the disciples. That's interesting because now I know why I memorized the disciples in that order. It was always Peter, James, John, Andrew, Simon, Bartholomew, Thaddeus, I won't get them. But I'm clubs. It's the word is flubs here. But I'm close. Flubs and all. There is a tendency to portray Peter as a big, slow thinking lug. This is a mistake. It wasn't ignorance that tripped up Peter, but rather enthusiasm. Even his greatest fault, denying Christ on that crucial night, didn't arise from ignorance or even self-preservation, but rather confusion. Several events show his unbridled enthusiasm. Peter walks on water. The Gospel of Matthew records a strange event. The disciples were taking a boat across the Sea of Galilee, while Jesus stayed ashore for a time of private prayer. As sometimes happens with large inland seas, a storm arose quickly, battering the boat and the disciples in it. Although Peter and some of the others were seasoned sailors, the storm was proving too much for them. Through the darkness, they saw the dim figure of Jesus walking on the water, untroubled by the gale. At first, they assumed the figure to be a ghost. What could make things worse? Darkness and ghosts. Then Jesus called to them, telling them not to fear. Peter makes a strange request. Lord, if it is you, you command me to come to you on the water. Jesus simply said, come. For a brief time, Peter did what only Jesus has done, walk on water in a storm. Then he took his eyes from Jesus, focusing on the stinging winds and threatening waves. As Peter began to sink into the storm-tossed sea, Jesus reached out and rescued him. Although it wasn't a perfect example of faith, it was nonetheless bold and showed great courage. Peter, if for only a moment displayed belief, that Jesus could enable him to do the impossible. Jesus washes Peter's feet. During Jesus' most difficult day, those hours before his betrayal, arrest, torture, and execution, he gathered with his disciples in the upper room where he instituted the Lord's Supper. He also did something that stunned the disciples, especially Peter. Jesus washed their feet. See John chapter 13, 15 through 5, verse 5 through 11. To the 21st century mind, this may not seem like much, but washing someone else's feet was considered demeaning in Jesus' day. While it was customary to provide water so guests could clean the dust from their feet, it could not be required that the host do the job for their guests. Not even Jewish slaves could be required to wash the feet of another, yet Jesus chose to do this humbling task. It was too much for Peter, seeing Jesus on his knees, water bowl nearby, and towel in hand unsettled him. "Never shall you wash my feet," he exclaimed. Jesus' response was pointed. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." That brought an immediate change. "Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." The list is longer. Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23 records Jesus' harshest correction of Peter. Jesus has been once again teaching the disciples about his pending suffering and death in Jerusalem and the resurrection that would follow. Peter focused only on Jesus' words about his death, proclaimed, "God forbid it, Lord. This shall never happen to you." It was beyond imagination that his Lord would go through such affliction. Peter's words come across as a reprimand, and Jesus returns it with intensity. "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's." What makes this interesting is Jesus had moments before called Peter and his confession of faith the rock upon which the church will be founded. Again, Peter's unrestrained enthusiasm brought him grief. Peter would do other things that he would regret, but none more devastating than making a promise he couldn't keep. In the same upper room where Jesus had washed his feet, there unfolded a brief dialogue that haunted Peter the rest of his life. "Jesus, you will all fall away because of me this night." Jesus is saying this. "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter, even though all may fall away because of you, I will not. Jesus, truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. See Matthew 26, verse 31 through 35. It is difficult to understand the depth of sorrow percolating in Jesus. Before him were the 11 remaining disciples, Judas having already left to become history's most famous traitor, each staring back at him and attempting a courage they surely felt but couldn't maintain. They left the upper room and walked from the city across the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus would begin an inward suffering that few can imagine. Peter, James, and John slept nearby while he agonized. Then came the hour of arrest. The mob, consisting of Roman soldiers, temple guards, religious leaders, and their servants, perhaps numbering in the hundreds, came for Jesus. At the front of the pack was Judas. Peter, in defense of Jesus, courageously attacked with his sword, cutting off the ear of a servant. We can be certain Peter wasn't aiming for the man's ear. Peter was ready to die to protect Jesus. just as he said. But before further violence occurred, Jesus stopped Peter, told him to put the sword away, and healed the wounded servant. Jesus left the mob willingly, leaving Peter and the others to follow at a distance. After enduring much persecution, Jesus was led to the home of the high priest Caiaphas. Peter and others waited in the courtyard of the house. A servant girl approached Peter and said, "You too were with Jesus, the Galilean." Peter responded, "I do not know what you are talking about." He let the lie hang in the air and moved to the gate. Another servant girl spoke up, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter denied the accusation, adding an oath, most likely calling God's judgment on himself if he were lying. "I do not know the man." He had come a long way from confessing Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now he just referred to Jesus as the man. Then someone made the third accusation, "Surely you two are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away." The last comment may have been a reference to Peter's Galilean accent. Peter swore. Peter cursed. "I do not know the man." And then the rooster crowed. Peter fled in tears, a wreck. See Matthew chapter 26, verse 69 through 75. Was this cowardice? Maybe, but he had been willing to take on a large crowd single-handedly, so something else must have been at work. His world was collapsing. He had failed to protect Jesus in the garden. His Lord was bound and enduring abuse. In the maelstrom of emotion and confusion, Peter folded. It is doubtful anyone would have done better. The memory would never leave him. It dogged his steps and haunted the halls of his mind. It also forged him into the greatest leader the church has seen. And all of this was just the first act. From darkness to light. The New Testament records 12 resurrection appearances of Christ. He appeared to key women such as Mary Magdalene, to the disciples in the upper room, and to as many as 500 on a hillside in Galilee. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he records, he appeared to Cephas, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5. Cephas, Peter's Aramaic name and the one Jesus gave him. We have no details of that meeting, just a reference to its occurrence. It was a private meeting between the denied and the denier. We have no idea what Jesus said, but whatever words passed restored Peter's faith and enlivened his mission. A month later came Pentecost, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the disciples and other followers of Jesus. I don't understand why they say we have no idea what Jesus said, because we do know, and that's where the author left it, because we do know he said, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep." Yeah, 3 times. "Lord, do you know that I love you?" Like, what are you getting at? Feed my people. And I'm almost sure that came after the resurrection. But maybe not. Anyway, a month later came Pentecost, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the disciples and other followers of Jesus. Scholars believe that this is the birth of the church. Prior to this event, Jerusalem, the church, was nothing more than a huddle of frightened disciples and about 120 followers who feared they would suffer as Jesus had. Preaching a message that still echoes through time, Peter wants the man back. Preaching a message that echoes through time, Peter, once the man backed down by a servant girl, called thousands of eyewitnesses at Pentecost to turn to God through faith in Jesus Christ. Acts chapter 2. Not only was the message of Christ's resurrection made clear, so was Peter's leadership role. Where once was a boastful man who descended into a nervous breakdown, there now stood a champion, fearless and outspoken. It was a finger-wagging sermon, one that not only exalted Jesus, but laid the responsibility of the crucified Christ at the feet of religious leaders, political leaders, Romans, and all of those in the crowd who had chanted, "Crucify him, crucify him." No one could back Peter down that day or any day thereafter. A group numbering around 120 followers had, by day's end, grown to over 3,000. I'm sure this author is correct, but I am not sure about that fact. About when Jesus said that. Feed my sheep. On the job adjustments, learning to love the Gentiles. Peter led the church in Jerusalem and its outreach for years after. He had to make several adjustments to his own thinking. Jews of the day had little respect for Gentiles. It would take a vision from God for Peter to accept the idea that Gentiles could be Christians. 2. Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 33. Peter had become teachable. After years of leading the church in Jerusalem, Peter was called to leave Jerusalem and begin a mission to the Gentiles. Many think Paul was the first to take the message to Jesus to the Gentiles, but it was Peter who first charted that course. When it became Paul's primary mission, Peter had already been preaching to the Gentiles for some time. Pope? Peter remained faithful throughout his life. Unlike Paul, he did very little writing. The New Testament has only 2 books of his, 1 and 2 Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter. In them, we can sense his dedication to and love for the church. Peter was the first pastor, bishop, and along with the other disciples, one of the first missionaries. He was a transitional man who took a fledgling church and guided it into something great. Jesus made 2 predictions about Peter. The first, Matthew 16, chapter 13 through 19, is the most debated. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they said, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on the church shall be loosed in heaven." The debate centers on the supremacy of Peter over the other disciples. Roman Catholics and others see this as the setting apart of Peter to be the first pope. Protestants believe Jesus is talking about the confession of faith Peter makes, but not about Peter himself. Certainly, Jesus bestowed a great deal of authority and responsibility on Peter, more than any other disciple. No matter what view we take on the controversy, we can agree that Peter, from the day he was called by Jesus, was the leader of the disciples and eventually was leader of the first church. Others would follow and do marvelous things, but there must always be a first, and Peter was it. The upside down cross. Peter was also one of the first to suffer under persecution, landing in jail several times for preaching about the resurrected Jesus. Persecution would spread throughout Jerusalem to the rest of the world. The New Testament doesn't reveal how Peter died, but tradition tells us that he was martyred in Rome and at his request crucified upside down. There is a footnote there. So there is a reference there. Chapter 1, Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, 3.1.2. That's the reference. There is also a tradition, an account also not found in the New Testament, that Peter's wife was also martyred, something he was forced to witness. That is referenced in Clement of Alexandria, Stromatius, 7.11. Wow. Didn't know that. Wouldn't mind getting my hands on that. Wow. Peter's life continues to inspire the church throughout the honest portrayal of his courage and his faults. He is the apostle behind the Gospel of Mark, most likely the first gospel written with the aid of John Mark. He became the first to spread the story of Jesus in written form. Through that gospel and his 2 letters, he continues to guide the church that was born on Pentecost. The same day Peter was transformed into an unstoppable force. An entire book would not be enough to analyze this great shaper of the church. One chapter scarcely does the job. Still, we see a complicated man who lost, then regained his courage, a man who became the catalyst in the rise of Christianity. His contribution to the early church is matched only by one other man, Paul, which is chapter 2. I think I'm going to stop there. That was a juicy chapter, I think. One thing also that I find interesting about that chapter is that very last statement, that one chapter scarcely does enough. Well, I've read all the Bible, and they've told me things in this scarce chapter I didn't know. So where are you getting the other sources for this information? I find that very interesting. So I'm going to do a little bit of research on that. We might talk about it in the Bookless classroom. I'm not sure. We're not to New Testament time, but we are talking about world religions. So I love the way, and one spiritual guidance that you really can see, I always have those puppet hands, those Muppet hands, that I think that you can see is to see a clear pattern of message between the 3 classes that I have not at all had any premise to prepare in that way. An example would be world religions came up for the title of Early Birds, and then came up for the title in my mind for the Bookless classroom, where we took a jaunt into world religions if you're interested. This really is likely a change of church. So you're talking about a Christian perspective here in these writings, and likely because it's not a Catholic writing and exclusive to Catholics, it's going to have a real Protestant spin on it, whatever that means to you. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks so much for joining me here. Let me see how many minutes we've been on. Oh, it's not there. Only 33 minutes. So I liked us getting through the other chapter or the other book in 10 different stories, and or 10 different reading rooms, sorry, episodes of the reading room. So I'll probably, although Paul does look kind of short, let's read it. Chapter 2, Paul, the unstoppable apostle. 5 through 67 AD. For I am the least of the apostles and not fit to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. You know, that's Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 9. This is something I've always said about how I know that it is God and God speaking. And this is very clear to me. It has been clear to me for many years. So I know, like, when God is speaking. How do I know? One way I know, and I've said it before, is the emotion that rises in me. When I read some of these things, it can be very emotional to me. I suppress it. But if I were to ponder on it and not continue reading here in the reading room, it would make me tear up. Paul, the unstoppable apostle. And if I read it a second time, it's not so emotional. There are other words of God that I find to be just like the prayer of St. Francis, right? To be very, very emotional. But you should key into that. If you want to know where God is speaking to you in Scripture, where is God speaking to you from your best friend? Where is God speaking to you in your prayer life? Really, what makes you emotional about it? Just really emotional. A lot of times when there is trauma, cognitive dysfunctioning, whatever you want to call it, the first emotion that comes, and most severe, is anger. That's where God's trying to talk to you. She knows some shit. For I am the least of the apostles and not fit to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. I love the way that they get to the depths of the emotions of both Peter and what Paul said. He knows his sin and he knows the extent of it. He knows the greatness of his sin. That's powerful stuff. No one did more for the faith, but no one seemed less likely. Bruce L. Shelley says of Paul in his Church History in Plain Language. There's another site for that. Only those with the hardest of hearts could have looked on the scene without emotion. Several men carried the lifeless body of a man out of the city of Lystra. It was the last act of a mob stirred to action by the man's enemies. His body showed the torture he had endured. He was a victim of stoning, a painful, gruesome, horrible death. Like most accused, he had been thrown into a shallow pit as his self-appointed executioners gathered around the rim. They had tossed off their outer garments, picked up stones the size of baseballs, and hurled them at the victim. Stones struck his back, arms, legs, and head. The pummeling continued until all were convinced he was dead. That wasn't the end of this indignity. The assailants dragged the man's broken and bleeding body from the pit and carried it outside the limits of the city. It was what the first century Jews did with executed criminals. No Jewish burial for this victim. He would be left to rot in the sun and be ravaged by scavengers. Few things repulsed Jews more. The man left in the dirt along the roadside was one of the most honored, best-known people in history. He, like many Jews of his day, was a man of multiple names, Saul and Paul. The stoning of Paul has a connection to another stoning, one in which he had participated approximately 16 years before Paul, better known then by his Jewish name, Saul, stood on the rim of a similar pit, consenting and perhaps orchestrating the stoning death of a young man named Stephen, a deacon in the fledgling Jerusalem church. Stephen was not an apostle. We have no idea how long he had been a Christian. Perhaps he was one of the outer circle of disciples who followed Jesus, we know very little about the man, but what we do know is impressive. The defense of the gospel that Stephen gave to the earlier persecutors of the church showed him to be logical and well-versed in Jewish history. So powerful was his message that it enraged many of the listeners and led to his execution. As he looked up at the conclusion of his defense, Stephen saw a vision of Jesus. About that, Stephen is the first martyr of the church, the Catholic Church to be more specific, so he is a saint. But more to this point of this reading about Stephen, and that is that he caused a ruckus, which led to his stoning. At the same time, Peter was giving a similar speech to acquire fellowship, right? And learned how to speak to the Pharisees and the Sadducees in ways that didn't end up in his stoning and death at that time, right? So this is interesting that Peter was an apostle, while Stephen, not as versed, not as beat up, not as intimately involved in the life of Jesus, makes the mistake of being too zealous. But clearly not a mistake. I mean, ask Stephen, did you like the way that you ended your life? And I bet he'd be like, yeah, hell yeah. Hell yeah. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? A decade and a half later, Paul would be on the receiving end of a stoning for the same crime as Stephen, preaching the same kind of message in the same manner. Paul's stoning ended differently. The battered apostle, after being surrounded by his fellow Christians, rose and continued his ministry. Had he been dead? Many soldiers think so, and if so, then he experienced a resurrection. If not, then he was still a recipient of a miracle. Few people survived a stoning. Lystra was a city in what is now Turkey. It was a Gentile region where belief in Roman gods like Zeus and Hermes thrived. I think it's Hermes. Where Peter's ministry was aimed largely at his fellow Jews, although he did preach to the Gentiles, Paul took the gospel message to the non-Jews of the Roman Empire. It's possible Paul's journeys took him as far as Spain. He was an apostle in the truest sense. The Greek meaning of apostle is sent out one, and its modern English equivalent is ambassador or messenger. You know, I didn't highlight in Peter's, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna highlight for Paul. But those are some good little facts that you get out there. And I like those, I like those facts, to highlight those facts, because they're unequivocal. They're unarguable, right? You can't argue that that's what his name means, or that's what apostle means, or whatever. Rome could be a hard taskmaster, often treating the inhabitants of conquered lands cruelly and taxing them heavily. But the empire also provided roads and laws that made travel safer. Sounds like the United States. Paul made good use of these, but the work was not easy, and Paul endured much. By his own account, see 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 through 29. He suffered imprisonments and more beatings than he could count. He faced death repeatedly, received 39 lashes on 5 occasions, and was beaten with wooden rods 3 times. He endured shipwreck 3 times and was left to float a day and night in the ocean. He faced robbers, forded rivers, suffered persecution from his fellow Jewish leaders, and faced the same kind of persecution from Gentiles. He was oftentimes without food, drink, or sleep, and he suffered from exposure. These things he endured for people he didn't know, people he wouldn't even have spoken to a few years before. As a first-century Jew, he culturally would have had little use for Gentiles. Down and out in Damascus, How does a man go from being a person who persecutes the church to becoming its greatest promoter? Sometime soon after the stoning of Stephen, Saul received permission and support from the Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem to carry out the first wave of persecution in Christians, starting in Damascus, a city about 140 miles, a week-long journey from Jerusalem. It is doubtful that Saul met Jesus during his ministry. Most likely Saul, who was born and reared in Tarsus, south-central Turkey, was not in the region during Jesus' 3-year ministry. He did, however, meet Jesus in a most unexpected way. With Jerusalem behind him and Damascus to the north, Saul had led his team of thugs near the city when a blinding light surrounding him so suddenly and apparently with such force, he was knocked to the ground. See Acts chapter 9, 1ff. I don't know what that means. Chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. In today's language, we might call this an eye-opening event, but in Paul's case, it was an eye-closer. The light, apparently only seen by Paul, left him blind. Persecution is a difficult job for a sightless man. Lord, what do you want me to do? He trembled as he asked the question. Arise and go into the city. There you will be told what to do. Paul, leader of a band of persecutors with legal power granted by the high priests in Jerusalem to find, seize, and bring all Christians back to Jerusalem, now had to be helped to his feet and led by the hand into Damascus. Jesus had taken the fight out of the man. Yeah, you think so? That's an understatement. We can only wonder about Paul's private thoughts during the days that followed. Certainly he weighed Jesus' words. Why do you persecute me? Paul was a Pharisee, a conservative religious leader. He was an up-and-comer, a rising star in the religious world of Israel. His credentials were impeccable. He thought he was doing God a favor by attempting to stamp out the fledgling church. For 3 days, Paul sat in his blindness, refusing food and drink. His depression must have been crushing. No doubt he thought about the Christians he had imprisoned and the accusations he had made. No doubt the image of Stephen's battered corpse came to mind. Paul's world had been turned upside down. 3 days later, a disciple named Ananias arrived at the home where Paul was staying. In a vision, Jesus had ordered him to deliver a message to the infamous persecutor. Ananias was not keen on the idea. What Christian would be? Paul's reputation had preceded him. However, Ananias, despite his reservations, went and laid hands on Paul. A moment later, Paul's sight was restored. His first sight was the face of a man whom Paul would have arrested had he not encountered Jesus on the road. Saul of Tarsus became Paul the Apostle. Jesus would appear to him several times, and over the next few years, Paul went about the arduous task of earning the trust of the people he had previously sought to persecute. An educated man. Prior to his conversion, Saul used his misguided genius to cause harm. After his conversion, Paul used the same genius to help shape and expand the church throughout the known world. In many ways, Paul was the perfect choice to be an apostle. Henry Van Dyke, Presbyterian minister, writer, and U.S. ambassador in the early years of the 20th century, said, "Genius is talent set on fire by courage." Girls and boys, that's what I'm talking about. The more we study the life of Paul, the more we come to realize, I'm going to say that again. Genius is talent set on fire by courage, by belief, by the Holy Spirit, by inspiration, by what you believe. Again, by what you believe. See our Bookless classroom. It starts from the fire above, not from the fire below. Although the fire in your belly sure helps it along. The more we study the life of Paul, the more we come to realize that he is to the Christian faith what Einstein is to physics, Jonas Salk is to medicine, and Charles Dickens is to literature, and Charles Darwin is to evolution. When the appearance of Jesus knocked Paul to the hard-packed road to Damascus, he was not only stopping a man intent on tormenting Christians, he was calling a man of enormous talent and expansive intellect. Today, Paul would be called a polymath. A polymath is a person of encyclopedic knowledge, an individual of wide-ranging learning. Can a first century Jewish religious conservative living under Roman rule truly be called a genius? Paul certainly could. Growing up in Tarsus, a university town, he had access to the finest and Greco-Roman education, including its libraries. In the New Testament, evidence of this education is seen in Paul quoting ancient Gentile poets. But his education was also Jewish. He was, after all, a member of a staunch Jewish family, one associated with the very conservative Pharisees, the group that gave Jesus so much difficulty and ultimately conspired to end his life. He studied under one of the most influential rabbis of the day, Gamaliel. Today we would say Paul had an Ivy League education. He knew several languages. As a Jew, he would have learned Hebrew, which was still spoken among Jews, especially during religious ceremonies. Aramaic was the common language of the Jews in Paul's time, and had been the dormant language for over 500 years. Wow. A dormant language. That's amazing, isn't it? Paul also showed a deep understanding of Koine Greek. Koine, K-O-I-N-E, Greek is common Greek. We can think of it as street Greek or everyday Greek or Spanglish. A different example. Scholars can point out whose writing was simple and whose was advanced. Paul's writing showed a deep familiarity with the language. He may have been adept at classical Greek as well. Paul was also familiar with Latin, as he lived and worked in Roman-occupied lands. Paul was also a biblical scholar. In his days, the Jews studied the Tanakh, what most Christians today call the Old Testament. Paul's ministry focused on Gentiles, but his writing was very Jewish, filled with references Jews would immediately recognize. Paul was at heart a teacher. He studied to be a rabbi, someone responsible for teaching God's truth to others and guiding their spiritual behavior. That did not change when Paul became a Christian. His theology did, however. Paul became a preacher. He is considered one of the finest communicators to have lived, which is ironic since he held his speaking skills in such low regard. He wrote in reference to himself, "His letters are weighty and powerful, but his physical presence is weak and his public speaking is despicable." 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10, HCSB. I'm not sure which Bible that is. Despite what shortcomings he saw in his preachings and teaching, history has shown that his words have changed millions of lives. Writer, speaker, scholar, linguist, preacher, teacher, innovative communicator, church planter, defender of the faith, and more, Paul is worthy of his title, genius. If Henry Van Dyke is correct that genius is talent set on fire by courage, then could the second president of the United States, John Adams, also be right when he said, "Genius is sorrow's child"? It was true for Paul. Being an intellectual giant and a spiritual dynamo didn't protect him from persecution, hardship, hatred, and martyrdom. Earlier, we listed some of the physical torments Paul endured in his ministry, but there were many emotional afflictions as well. Like Jesus, he was rejected by his people. Paul's method of operation was simple but difficult. Visit a city situated at the crossroads of well-traveled roads, preach in the local synagogue, get beaten and tossed out most of the time, then take the same message to the Gentiles. Few men would have continued such a practice. Paul observed, apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 28, verse 28 through 29. I love that. Who is led into sin without my intense concern? Paul was a tortured man, physically and emotionally. He carried a heavy burden, yet he continued on until his death by beheading in the middle of the first century. It's important to note that Paul was a Roman citizen. This was not common among Jews, but somehow his family had earned the right to be called citizens of the empire, and this gave Paul certain protections. It is why Paul was executed by beheading, a quick execution. Roman law protected her citizens from death by crucifixion. Standing up for the outsiders. Okay, so Jesus was a Jew. Paul was a Jew, but he was considered protected under Roman law. A Roman citizen as well. Interesting. Standing up for outsiders. One of the greatest challenges Paul faces was ingrained racial prejudice. The early church was almost purely Jewish. Jesus was a Jew, as were all the apostles, and Paul was as Jewish as a man could be. Jews and Gentiles did not get along. One of the great sore spots in Jewish life was the constant presence of Romans on their turf. Tensions between Jews and Gentiles were often just a few degrees below boiling. A stone sign at the temple complex warned Gentiles that they faced death if they crossed a certain line. The warning read, "No foreigner is to enter within the balustrade and the embankment that goes around the sanctuary. If anyone is caught in the act, he must know that he has himself to blame for the penalty of death which will follow." They were serious. When it became clear that Gentiles were embracing Christ and his teaching, it caused confusion. It was difficult for Jews to believe that Gentiles could share in the same love and blessings of Christ that they did. That's such a great perspective, isn't it? Paul sided with the Gentile believers and at a council in Jerusalem convinced the others that the inclusion of foreigners had always been a part of God's plan. Paul would face other such challenges. Judaizers were a group of who believed that the Gentiles could be part of the church, but only after they first became Jews through ritual cleansing and circumcision. Paul would have none of that. Another group known as Gnostics troubled the Gentile church, teaching Jesus was someone other than who he said he was and promoting behavior contrary to Christian teaching. Paul spent much of his energies writing letters showing that they were in error and that his teaching and that of other apostles was correct. False teaching is never a good thing, but it did require Paul to record what Christians believe. He became the church's first theologian, the first to list the basic doctrines that bind Orthodox believers together, which sounds to me actually more like a pope than Peter did, don't you think? But, that's really disruptive, that Gnostic training, isn't it? Or that Gnostic teaching. That's very disruptive. False teaching is never... Okay, so Paul made great achievements in mission work, church planting, and the formation of Christian thinking, but his greatest work is work that is still touching lives and changing the world today, his writing. Paul shaped the church throughout the written word. After all, half of the New Testament was penned by him. The persecutor became the preeminent preacher of love and acceptance. It is hard to imagine what the church would look like today had Saul of Tarsus not experienced Christ on the road to Damascus. The early church needed an apostle like Paul. The contemporary church has need of the same. Amen, Alton. Thank you so much for such great writing and the fact that it is so popular. It has been published again and again. This is actually a 2014 edition, which probably has just a change of introduction is probably what it is. Yeah, 2014. Published by Alton Gansky. So he published it himself again. Oh, Baker Books. Copyright Alton Gansky. Published by Baker Books. In Grand Rapids, Michigan. Thanks so much for the publishing of that. Thanks so much for joining me here in the reading room. We got through now what would be our hour-long reading room. I kind of like that. I do like an hour-long reading room. We need to be read to, and we need to be read to in ways that will generate some great thought. I love this. 60 People Who Shaped the Church. I also have a little deja vu like I've read this. But I know I read those too. I don't know if I read more and just plan to read this. I actually literally have to look up. But I wouldn't have read that whole book. Doesn't matter. Dr. Annette Feravich chewing her gum to keep her coffee breath, etc. clean and fresh. And also actually just to keep my mouth moist while I'm reading. Dr. Annette Feravich, we are here in the classroom. It is day 256. Thanks so much for joining me, where we are here in the reading room. Really a different way of keeping your mind, your body, and your spirit healthier. Thanks so much for joining me. Not the ABC song. That's not what we need. There we go. Thanks for joining me.